As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine a world where familiar roles are suddenly reversed. America, which has dictated the rules in North America for decades, finds itself in the position of the loser. And Canada, the country that many in Washington have come to call a quiet neighbor, suddenly becomes a force capable not only of defending its interests, but also of setting a new agenda. It all started with a single spark, a conflict between the federal government in Ottawa and the province of Alberta. At first glance, it was a routine dispute over oil, gas, and climate policy. But behind the scenes, something much more serious was going on, a game of survival in which world powers intervened.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
The American leader used an old tactic: divide and rule. He pushed Alberta toward separatism, promised deals, hinted at recognition and special status. The plan seemed flawless: weaken Canada, gain access to its resources, and take control of the energy sector on which America itself depends. But this is where things did not go according to plan. The new Canadian Prime Minister did what no one expected. He did not respond to the ultimatum with an ultimatum. Instead, he turned the tables so that the threat of division became an opportunity for unity. A typical politician would have defended himself, talked about laws, and appealed to patriotism. But he opted for cooperation. He showed that conflicts do not have to tear the country apart, that even the toughest demands can be turned into a basis for dialogue. While Washington was counting on chaos and weakness, Ottawa demonstrated cold calculation and a willingness to play the long game.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The result? Not only the neutralization of separatist sentiments, but also the launch of a large-scale economic project worth hundreds of billions of dollars. A project that links energy and climate agenda interests, creates jobs, and strengthens Canada's position on the world stage. The US no longer rules North America unilaterally. For the first time in decades, Washington is faced with the fact that its northern neighbor can dictate terms. And while the crisis is turning into an opportunity in Canada, a new fire is raging in Europe. The American president signs a deal that he presents as a great success. But instead of applause, there is anger. European countries see this not as an alliance, but as humiliation. Tariffs are rising, trade is collapsing, and Parliament is threatening to scupper a deal worth hundreds of billions of dollars. What was supposed to be a triumph is turning into a disaster.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Two different strategies, two different approaches to leadership. One is based on threats and blackmail. The other is based on seeking compromise and the ability to listen. The only question is which path will ultimately prevail. Today we will tell you how one unexpected turn of events in Ottawa changed the balance of power in North America, why Washington found itself on the defensive, and what all this means for a world where allies are increasingly becoming adversaries. This is a story about how cooperation can be stronger than confrontation, and about why the coming months will be a test, not only for Canada and the US, but for the entire global system. When Canada's new Prime Minister took office in early July, he hardly expected his first days on the job to resemble a political thriller. A folder with the Alberta coat of arms landed on his desk in Ottawa. Inside was a document that journalists immediately dubbed 9 Demands. Formally, it looked like a list of proposals from the provincial government on energy, taxes, and the distribution of natural resource revenues. But the political subtext concealed a challenge comparable to the threat of a split. Alberta had been in tense relations with the federal government for many years. The oil and gas-rich province felt that its interests were being ignored and its resources exploited. Now the situation had come to a head. The main point that caused the storm concerned the so-called emissions cap in the oil and gas sector. Ottawa planned to limit carbon emissions, effectively forcing oil companies to reduce production. In Edmonton, this move was seen as an attack on the region's economy. The Premier of Alberta stated that such a cap would function as a hidden limit on production, and threatened tens of thousands of jobs. The demands contained a direct condition: either the federal government abandons the idea of a cap, or the province reserves the right to reconsider its place in the federation.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The second point of the demands was even more explosive. Alberta insisted on the right to independently conclude energy agreements with foreign partners, bypassing Ottawa. For the first time in many years, the province openly hinted at the possibility of direct deals with Washington, which in Canadian politics is effectively tantamount to flirting with separatism. Here, too, the coincidences were too obvious not to arouse suspicion. American officials and advisors close to Donald Trump had been visiting Calgary and Edmonton for several months. According to official reports, these were meetings held as part of energy conferences. But behind the scenes, something else was being discussed: a hypothetical future in which Alberta could act as an independent partner to the US. This was a wake-up call for the federal government. Historians immediately drew parallels with crises of the past century, when the western provinces had already expressed dissatisfaction with the distribution of oil revenues. But back then, Washington remained a neutral observer. Now, however, it was clearly pushing the situation in the direction it wanted. The Canadian press reported that in closed-door negotiations, Trump's representatives had promised Alberta preferential treatment in the American market, including special arrangements for oil supplies. And although no documents were published, the tone of the provincial leaders' statements showed that the talks were serious.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
A real political crisis loomed over Ottawa. If Alberta had gone beyond words and begun the process of leaving the Confederation, it would have been the first such case in Canadian history. But unlike previous periods of tension, this time the confrontation coincided with global energy turbulence. Oil prices were rising worldwide, the US was desperately seeking new sources of supply, and Canada was just beginning a project to modernize its climate policy. All this turned the dispute over the 9 demands into an event that went far beyond the national agenda. When journalists asked the Canadian Prime Minister how he assessed the ultimatum from Edmonton, many expected a harsh response. Previous leaders in similar situations had either made threats or invoked the sanctity of the Constitution, but his response was completely different. He said that he did not view the list as demands or a war on the Federation, but rather as a set of issues that needed to be addressed in the interests of citizens. With one sentence, he diffused the confrontation, and this move proved decisive. Instead of opposing Alberta, he took a step toward it. He recalled his childhood on the Canadian prairies, when conflicts between Ottawa and the western provinces also seemed irresolvable. At that time, the Prime Minister said, the parties managed to find a compromise and preserve unity. This personal touch did not seem accidental. It transformed the problem from a dry political battle into a national story in which every Canadian recognized something familiar. The tactic worked. Even some conservative publications, which traditionally supported Alberta, acknowledged that the Prime Minister had defused the bomb without a single shout or threat. But he did not stop there. He soon announced a plan for a so-called big deal, which included new projects to modernize the oil and gas industry and parallel investments in green technologies. Thus, what yesterday looked like a direct path to the division of the country became the basis for negotiations on a shared future.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Washington reacted nervously to this maneuver. According to journalists, American advisors expected the Canadian government to act aggressively, exacerbating the conflict. It was in the chaos that the US saw an opportunity to gain control over energy flows. But instead, Ottawa showed that it knew how to stay one step ahead. This was the fundamental contrast. Trump relied on pressure, stirring up discontent and exploiting his neighbors' weaknesses. The Canadian Prime Minister chose the opposite path, demonstrating respect, a willingness to listen, and the ability to engage his opponent in joint work. This move not only deprived the separatist movement of its footing, but also changed the world's perception of Canada. For the first time in many years, the country looked not like a quiet neighbor of the United States, but like an entity capable of setting the rules. Thus, the first 2 points of the story are the path from ultimatum to unexpected response. Alberta tried to force the Federation into a game of elimination, using outside support and threatening a split, but the Premier did not accept the terms of this game. He pretended that he was not facing a time bomb, but a construction set from which a new project could be assembled. Such a move is rare in politics, and that is precisely why it became a turning point, after which the balance of power in North America could no longer be the same. This conflict showed that real power sometimes lies not in striking first, but in neutralizing the blow before it is delivered. And if Canada does indeed become the new leader of the region in the coming years, the starting point will be this very episode, the story of the 9 demands that could have torn the country apart, but instead became a catalyst for its strengthening. What began as a threat of disintegration unexpectedly turned into an opportunity for strategic maneuvering. The Prime Minister, having taken the first step toward Alberta, realized that a single conciliatory gesture would not be enough. Separatist sentiments cannot be silenced with words alone. They must be replaced with something more substantial, a project that will give the province not only a sense of recognition, but also tangible benefits. This is where the idea of the so-called Big Deal, or as it was later called in the press, the Canadian Compromise, was born.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The essence was simple, and at the same time bold. Instead of waging an endless war between the economic interests of the oil province and the climate goals of the federal center, the Prime Minister proposed to combine these interests into a single plan. This plan included investments in the modernization of the oil and gas industry, the development of new carbon capture technologies, the construction of export infrastructure, and, at the same time, large-scale projects for the development of renewable energy. In this way, the province gained recognition of its importance to the economy, and Ottawa gained a tool for promoting its climate agenda. At first glance, it looked like clever accounting, but in reality it became a powerful political weapon. Alberta went from being an opponent of the Federation to its partner. Participation in the national project allowed the region to assert itself as a source of future growth rather than eternal conflict. Moreover, the press began to talk about the fact that, as part of the deal, a green corridor would appear in the province, a chain of enterprises working simultaneously on oil and renewable energy sources. For residents, this meant new jobs. For investors, confidence in long-term prospects, and for the federal government, a reduction in the risk of political destabilization.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
But the real power of the big deal was that it basically stopped outside interference. Over a few months, as we later found out, the US was actively telling Alberta that its future was on the other side of the border. Separatist groups received support, promises of lucrative oil contracts, and guarantees of international recognition. All of this was part of a strategy to pressure Canada into turning its neighbor into a convenient supplier of resources. But once Alberta became part of a nationwide project, these promises lost their meaning. Any move towards separatism would now look not like a fight for rights, but like a betrayal of lucrative agreements that could bring billions of dollars to the region. This is where the real contrast between the two political styles came into play. The American leader was betting on chaos, hoping that the crisis itself would push events in the right direction. His strategy was predictable: divide, sow distrust, offer quick benefits, and thereby gain control over resources. But the Canadian Prime Minister demonstrated a different model, one based on integration. He did not simply eliminate conflict, he turned it into a foundation for cooperation. That is why his actions began to be perceived not as a reaction to a threat, but as a long-term strategy for strengthening the country. Interestingly, the international press called the big deal either a Canadian chess move or a quiet revolution. While the American president continued to make loud proclamations about new trade victories, Ottawa was working systematically and almost imperceptibly to unite the country. Where Washington used the tactic of ultimatums, Canada demonstrated the art of compromise. But it didn't stop there. Soon, the Prime Minister took another step, this time a symbolic one. He publicly referred to history and reminded everyone that Canada had faced crises more than once when the provinces felt deprived. And each time, the solution was found not in confrontation, but in negotiation. He spoke not in the language of threats, but in the language of memory, emphasizing that the unity of the country is not an abstract slogan, but a time-tested mechanism for survival. At that moment, it became clear that this was no longer just about politics, but about a new philosophy of leadership.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The American president, on the contrary, was sinking deeper and deeper into the logic of conflict. His attempts to influence Canada coincided with large-scale trade disputes with Europe, where allies were speaking out more and more loudly about the unfairness of the new tariffs. Observers got the impression that Washington was opening several fronts at once, both within North America and overseas. The contrast was striking. While one leader tried to hold on to power through threats, the other strengthened his country's position through trust and cooperation. This contrast was also significant for Alberta. At closed-door meetings in Calgary, business people and representatives of the energy sector said outright that they were tired of being pawns in someone else's game. They needed a stable market, long-term contracts, and confidence that the federal government would not treat them as a source of endless problems. The big deal offered just that. As a result, even those who had previously supported separatist slogans began to see the benefits of the new course. Thus, a new reality was born. The province, which until recently had been ready to challenge Ottawa, became the flagship of a nationwide project, and the American pressure tactic failed. What was supposed to lead to destabilization unexpectedly strengthened Canada. This was the main irony. Instead of weakening its northern neighbor, outside interference pushed it toward consolidation. At the same time, the Prime Minister's international reputation grew. Foreign publications ran articles suggesting that his management style could become a new model for countries where federalism and regional conflicts are traditionally perceived as threats. Analysts in London and Berlin compared Canada's approach to European attempts to strike a balance between the center and the regions. While Washington was losing the trust of its allies, Ottawa unexpectedly became a source of political inspiration. Thus, the two midpoints of the story show not only the evolution of the crisis, but also the formation of fundamentally different leadership strategies. One strategy was based on division, artificially inflaming contradictions and promising quick gains. The other was based on complex negotiations, compromises, and a willingness to see conflict as a resource for development. And while one country was rocked by scandals and trade wars, the other used that same energy to strengthen its own resilience. Ultimately, it was this contrast that became the main discovery. The big deal in Canada turned out to be more than just an energy or climate project. It became a symbol that politics can be different, based not on fear and threats, but on respect and calculation. And if a new era has indeed begun in North America, then its birth should be counted from the moment when the conflict in Alberta was turned into a foundation for national unity, and external attempts at intervention turned into their author's own defeat. While the dust from the Canadian events had not yet settled, the center of world drama shifted across the Atlantic. The European Union found itself on the brink of the biggest economic crisis in recent years because of a trade deal signed in Washington. Formally, this agreement was supposed to become a new foundation for transatlantic cooperation, as the White House claimed, but the numbers told a different story. European markets, accustomed to a fragile balance, saw the document not as an alliance, but as a unilateral dictate. In 2024, Europe purchased nearly $370 billion worth of goods from the US, while American imports from Europe did not even reach $70 billion. The New Deal cemented this imbalance, leaving American tariffs untouched and forcing European tariffs to be cut by almost half. For Brussels, this was humiliating. Protests broke out in Paris and Berlin, with demonstrators carrying placards with slogans against new economic vassalage. In Brussels, leading members of the European Parliament said the document undermines the sovereignty of the continent. Particularly painful was Washington's decision to maintain and even increase the so-called national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were introduced during Trump's first term. They have now risen from 25 to 50%, which has effectively made deliveries to the US economically unviable. The expansion of the tariff list caused a particular scandal. In August, more than 400 product categories were added to it, ranging from construction materials to beverage ingredients. European manufacturers saw this not just as protectionism, but as a blatant attempt to stifle competition. For many companies, this meant billions in losses. Unsurprisingly, support ratings for the agreement in Europe plummeted. In Germany, more than 80% of respondents said the deal was unfair. In France, the figure exceeded 90%.